Number 1. As one approaches some crossroads, one comes to a sign which says that drivers have to stop when they come to the main road ahead. At other crossroads, drivers have to go slow, but they do not actually have to stop, unless, of course, there is something coming along the main road. And at still others, they do not have either to stop or to go slow, because they are themselves on the main road. Mr. Williams, who was always a very careful driver, was driving home from work one evening when he came to a crossroads. It had a slow sign, so he slowed down when he came to the main road, looked both ways to see that nothing was coming, and then drove across without stopping completely. At once he heard a police whistle, so he pulled in to the side of the road and stopped. A policeman walked over to him with a notebook and pencil in his hand and said, "You didn't stop at that crossing." "But the sign there doesn't say stop," answered Mr. Williams. "It just says slow, and I did go slow." The policeman looked around him, and a look of surprise came over his face. Then he put his notebook and pencil away, scratched his head and said, "Well, I'll be blowed. I am in the wrong street."
Number 2. Before the last war, officers in the Navy had a lot more freedom when their ship was in port than they have nowadays. They were expected to lead a busy social life and to take an active part in sport ashore. It was therefore rather difficult for them to find time to do all their other duties. Usually, all the officers in a ship used to have a regular meeting together once a week to receive orders from their captain, make reports, and discuss any business that had to be discussed, such as who should represent the ship in the next football match. One such meeting was being held on board a ship one day, and after the regular business had been completed, the time came to discuss the date of the next meeting. Friday of the next week was suggested, and so was Monday of the week after, but both of them interfered with somebody's arrangements for the weekend, and in the end it was generally agreed that the meeting should be held on Wednesday, as this would be the least likely day to interfere with anybody's convenience, since it was right in the middle of the week. As the officers were leaving, however, one of them was heard to say, "Wednesday is the worst day, because it interferes with 2 weekends."
Number 3. Mr. and Mrs. Williams had always spent their summer holidays in England in the past, in a small boarding house at the seaside. One year, however, Mr. Williams made a lot of money in his business, so they decided to go to Rome and stay at a really good hotel while they went around and saw the sights of that famous city. They flew to Rome and arrived at their hotel late one evening. They expected that they would have to go to bed hungry, because in the boarding houses they'd been used to in the past, no meals were served after 7 o'clock in the evening. They were therefore surprised when the clerk who received them in the hall of the hotel asked them whether they would be taking dinner there that night. "Are you still serving dinner, then?" asked Mrs. Williams. "Yes, certainly, madam," answered the clerk. "We serve it until 9:30. "What are the times of meals, then?" asked Mr. Williams. "Well, sir," answered the clerk, "we serve breakfast from 7 to 11:30 in the morning, lunch from 12 to 3 in the afternoon, tea from 4 to 5, and dinner from 6 to 9:30. "But that hardly leaves any time for us to see the sights of Rome," said Mrs. Williams in a disappointed voice.
Number 4.
Mrs. Black was having a lot of trouble with her skin, so she went to her doctor about it. He couldn't find anything wrong with her, however, so he sent her to the local hospital for some tests. The hospital, of course, sent the results of the tests direct to Mrs. Black's doctor, and the next morning he telephoned her to give her a list of the things that he thought she shouldn't eat, as any of them might be the cause of her skin trouble. Mrs. Black carefully wrote all the things down on a piece of paper, which she then left beside the telephone while she went out to a ladies' meeting. When she got back home 2 hours later, she found her husband waiting for her. He had a big basket full of packages beside him, and when he saw her, he said, "Hello, dear, I've done all your shopping for you." "Done all my shopping?" she asked in surprise. "But how did you know what I wanted?" "Well, when I got home, I found your shopping list beside the telephone," answered her husband. "So I went down to the shops and bought everything you'd written down." Of course, Mrs. Black had to tell him that he'd bought all the things the doctor didn't allow her to eat.
Number 5. Some young soldiers who had recently joined the army were being trained in modern ways of fighting, and one of the things they were shown was how an unarmed man could trick an armed enemy and take his weapon away from him. First, one of their 2 instructors took a knife away from the other, using only his bare hands, and then he took a rifle away from him in the same way. After the lesson, and before they went on to train the young soldiers to do these things themselves, the 2 instructors asked them a number of questions to see how well they had understood what they had been shown. One of the questions was this: "Well, you now know what an unarmed man can do against a man with a rifle. Imagine that you are guarding a bridge at night, and that you have a rifle. Suddenly, you see an unarmed enemy soldier coming towards you. What will you do?" The young soldier who had to answer this question thought carefully for a few seconds before he answered, and then said, "Well, after what I have just seen, I think that the first thing I would do would be to get rid of my rifle as quickly as I could, so that the unarmed enemy soldier couldn't take it from me and kill me with it."
Number 6. A certain poet had written a play, and arrangements were being made to perform it. Of course, the poet was asked to give his advice on the scenery, the lighting, and all the other things that helped to make a play successful, and he proved to be a very difficult man to please, as he had his own very definite ideas of how each scene should look. In one of the scenes in the play, it was necessary to produce the effect of a wonderful sunset, which the young lovers watched together before singing one of their great love songs. The theatre electricians worked very hard to produce this sunset effect. They tried out all kinds of arrangements and combinations of lights: red lights, orange lights, yellow lights, blue lights, lights from above, lights from behind, lights from the front, lights from the sides. But nothing satisfied the poet until suddenly he saw exactly the effect that he'd been dreaming of producing ever since he'd written his play. "That's it!" he shouted excitedly to the electricians behind the stage. "That's just right. Keep it exactly like that." "I'm sorry, sir," answered the chief electrician, "but we can't keep it like this." "Why ever not?" asked the poet angrily. "Because the theatre's on fire, sir," answered the chief electrician. "That's what's producing the effect you can see now."
Number 7. Nasruddin never seemed to have enough money to pay his bills, so he always owed money to the shopkeepers in his town. Most of them were patient, understanding men, and didn't speak to him very often about the money that he owed them. but there was one who was not at all patient, and who was also very fond of money. Whenever this man saw Nasruddin, he reminded him of the money that he hadn't yet paid him, and he very often did this in front of Nasruddin's best friends, which made Nasruddin feel very uncomfortable, as he didn't want his friends to know that he was so poor. One day, therefore, Nasruddin decided to teach the shopkeeper a lesson. The next time that the man stopped him in the street and began to shame him publicly about his debt to him, Nasruddin said, "Wait a minute, how much money do I in fact owe you?" "You owe me exactly 122 liras, answered the shopkeeper. "Well," said Nasruddin, "if I paid you 40 liras this month, another 40 next month, and 40 more the month after that, how much would I still owe you?" "You would then owe me 2 liras, of course," answered the shopkeeper. "Well, aren't you ashamed of yourself," Nasruddin said, "giving me all this trouble for only 2 liras?"
Number 8. Mrs. Baker's sister was ill. She had someone to look after her from Monday to Friday, but not at the weekend. So every Friday evening, Mrs. Baker used to go off to spend the weekend with her at her home in a neighbouring town. But as Mr. Baker couldn't cook, she had arranged for his sister to come over and spend the weekend looking after him at their home. This meant that Mr. Baker had quite a busy time when he came home from work on Friday evenings. First, he had to drive home from the railway station. Then he had to drive his wife to the station to catch her train. And then he had to wait until his sister's train arrived so as to take her to his house. Of course, on Sunday evening he had to drive his sister to the station to catch her train back home, and then wait for his wife's train so as to bring her home. One Sunday evening he'd seen his sister off on her train and was waiting for his wife's arrival when a porter, who had often seen him at the station, came over and spoke to him. "You're having a lot of fun," he said, "but one day one of those women is going to catch you with the other, and then you'll be in real trouble."
Number 9. A gay young man who earned his living as a drummer in a band had just married, and he and his wife were looking for somewhere to live. They saw a lot of places, but there was always something that one of them did not like about them. At last, however, they found a block of new flats which both of them really liked. However, there was still the problem of whether they should take one of the ground floor flats, which had a small garden, or one of the upstairs ones. At last they decided on a first floor flat, not too low down and not too high up, and moved in. After they had bought furniture, carpets, curtains, and all the rest, they gave a big party to celebrate the setting up of their first home together. It was a gay and noisy party, as all the host's friends from the band came and played their instruments. The guests danced, sang, and practiced on their host's drums. Soon after 1 a.m. the telephone rang. The hostess went to answer it in the hall, and after she had finished, came back with a happy smile on her face and said to her husband, "That was the man who has just moved into the flat downstairs telephoning, dear. I am so glad we decided not to choose it. He says it's terribly noisy down there."
Number 10. Just after the last war, people were very willing to give money to help those who had suffered from it. But not everyone who collected money was honest. The newspapers were full of stories of people who had been cheated by men who went from house to house saying that they were collecting for soldiers who had been seriously wounded in the war, or for people who had lost their homes, or for some other noble cause, while all the time they were putting the money they collected into their own pockets, instead of using it for the purposes they claimed to be collecting it for. One day, Mr. Smith came back with another story of this kind. He told his wife that a group of people had collected thousands of dollars for the widow of the unknown soldier. Then someone had written to the papers about it, and they had written articles to warn other people. Mr. Smith said that he and his friends at the office had had a good laugh about the story when they had read it in the newspaper. Can you imagine anyone being so stupid as to believe that story and give money for the widow of the unknown soldier? He asked his wife. She looked puzzled at first, but then her face brightened. "Oh, yes, I see now," she answered. "Of course, the government pays the widow of the unknown soldier."
Number 11. Mr. and Mrs. Davis had left their Christmas shopping very late. There were only a few days more before Christmas, and of course the shops and streets were terribly crowded. But they had to get presents for their family and friends. So they started out early one morning for the big city and spent several tiring hours buying the things they wanted in the big shops. By lunchtime, Mr. Davis was loaded down with parcels of all shapes and sizes. He could hardly see where he was going as he and his wife left the last shop on their way to the railway station and home. Outside the shop, they had to cross a busy street, made even busier than usual by the thousands of people who had come by car to do their last-minute Christmas shopping. Mr. and Mrs. Davis had to wait for the traffic lights to change, but as Mr. Davis couldn't see in front of him properly, he gradually moved forward into the road without realizing it. Mrs. Davis saw this and became worried. Several times she urged her husband to come back off the road, but without success. He couldn't hear her because of the noise of the traffic. Finally, she shouted in a voice that could be heard clearly above all the noise, "Henry, if you intend to stand in that dangerous position a moment longer, give me the parcels."
Number 12. Most of Nasruddin's neighbours were pleasant people who were always ready to help each other when they were in trouble. But there was one woman who lived in his street who was disliked by everybody because she was always interfering in other people's business, and because she was always borrowing things from people and then forgetting to give them back. Early one morning, Nasruddin heard a knock at his front door, and when he opened it, found this woman outside. "Good morning, Nasruddin," she said. "I have to take some things to my sister's house in the town today, and I haven't got a donkey, as you know. Will you lend me yours? I'll bring it back this evening." "I'm sorry," answered Nasruddin. "If my donkey was here, I would of course lend it to you very willingly, but it isn't." "Oh," said the woman, "it was here last night because I saw it behind your house. Where is it now?" "My wife took it into town early this morning," answered Nasruddin. Just then the donkey brayed loudly. "You're not telling the truth, Nasruddin," the woman said angrily. "I can hear your donkey. You should be ashamed of yourself, telling lies to a neighbour." "You're the one who should be ashamed, not me," shouted Nasruddin. "Is it good manners to believe a donkey's word rather than that of one's neighbours?"
Number 13. Nasruddin had to preach in the mosque every Friday, but he did not like this duty at all, and was always looking for ways to avoid it. One Friday he had a good idea. When he went up to begin to preach to the people in the mosque, he said to them, "Do you know what I am going to talk to you about?" They were surprised and answered, "No, we do not." Then Nasruddin said, "Well, if you don't know anything about such an important matter, it's a waste of time for me to talk to you about it." And he went down again without preaching to the people. The next Friday he again asked the question, "Do you know what I'm going to talk to you about today?" This time the people thought that they had learnt their lesson, so they all said, "Yes, we do." Then Nasruddin said to them, "Well, it's a waste of time to tell people things that they already know." And again he went down without preaching to the people. The third Friday, Nasruddin again said, "Do you know what I'm going to preach to you about today?" But this time some people answered yes, and some answered no. "Well," said Nasruddin, "if some of you know, and some of you do not, those that do can tell those that do not." And again he went down without saying another word.
Number 14. Late one night, Nasruddin was woken up by a terrible noise in the street outside his house. It sounded as if a terrible fight was going on, and as Nasruddin loved nothing better than to watch a fight in the street, he opened his window and looked out. He saw two young men fighting just outside his front door. But when they saw him watching them, they went round the corner of the house and continued to shout at each other and to hit each other there. Nasruddin didn't want to miss anything, so he ran down and opened his front door. But as it was a cold night, he wrapped himself in a blanket before he went out. He walked to the corner of his house and looked round it. The two men were still shouting and struggling. Nasruddin went closer to them, both to see the fight better and to try to find out what the men were fighting about. But as soon as he was within easy reach of the men, they stopped fighting, attacked him, seized his blanket, and ran away into the darkness with it. Nasruddin was too old to run after them, so he could do nothing but go sadly back to bed without his blanket. "Well," said his wife, "what were they fighting about?" "It seems that they were fighting about my blanket," answered Nasruddin, "because as soon as they got it, their quarrel ended."
Number 15. Mr. and Mrs. Jones's flat was full of suitcases, trunks, and packed-up furniture. The two of them were busy with pencils and paper, checking their lists of luggage, when there was a ring at the door. Mrs. Jones went to open it, and saw a well-dressed, middle-aged lady outside. The lady said that she lived in the flat beside theirs, and that she had come to welcome them to their new home. The Joneses invited her in, after apologizing for the state of the flat. "Oh, please don't stand on ceremony with me," she answered. "Do you know, in some parts of this town, neighbours are not at all friendly. There are some streets, and even some blocks of flats, where people don't know their neighbours, not even their next-door ones. But in this block of flats, everybody is friends with everybody else. We are one big, happy family. I'm sure that you'll be very happy here." The well-dressed lady got a shock when she came to visit the flat the next time, because she found a quite different man and woman in it. Mr. and Mrs. Jones hadn't had the courage to tell her that they were not the new owners of the flat, who were due to move in the next day, but the old owners, who had lived beside her for 2 years without her ever having visited them or even noticed their existence.
Number 16. Mr. Brown was at the theatre. He'd got his ticket at the last moment, so he'd not been able to choose his seat. He now found that he was in the middle of a group of American ladies, some of them middle-aged and some quite old. They obviously all knew each other well, as before the curtain went up on the play they'd come to see, they all talked and joked a lot together. The lady sitting on Mr. Brown's left, who was about 60 years old, seemed to be the happiest and the most amusing of the American group, and after the first act of the play she apologized to him for the noisiness of her friends. He answered that he was very glad to see American ladies so obviously enjoying their visit to England, and so they got into conversation. Mr. Brown's neighbour explained what they were doing there. "You know, I've known these ladies all my life," she said. "We all grew up together back in our hometown in the United States. They've all lost their husbands and call themselves the Merry Widows. It's a sort of club, you know. They go abroad every summer for a month or 2 and have a lot of fun. They always go everywhere together. I've wanted to join their club for a long time, but I didn't qualify for membership until the spring of this year."
Number 17. Mr. and Mrs. Brown were going abroad for their holiday. They had a dog called Blackie, which they were very fond of, but they couldn't take him abroad with them, so they looked for a good place to leave him while they were away, and at last found a place which looked after dogs very well while their owners were away. They took Blackie there just before they left for their holiday, and sadly said goodbye to him. At the end of their holiday, they got back to England very late at night, and as they thought that the place where Blackie was staying might be closed at that late hour, they decided to wait until the next morning before going to get him. So the next morning, Mr. Brown got into his car and drove off happily to collect Blackie. When he reached home with the dog, he said to his wife, "Do you know, dear, I don't think Blackie can have enjoyed his stay at that place very much. He barked all the way home in the car, as if he wanted to tell me something." Mrs. Brown looked at the dog carefully and then answered, "You are quite right, dear. He was certainly trying to tell you something, but he wasn't trying to tell you that he hadn't enjoyed his stay at that place. He was only trying to tell you that you were bringing the wrong dog home. This isn't Blackie."
Number 18. Nasruddin sat drinking coffee and talking with some of his old friends. One of the things they discussed was the difference between one person's sense of values and another's. After some minutes, one of Nasruddin's friends said to him, "Well, Nasruddin, you are a wise man, but you've said nothing on this subject yet. What do you consider to be the most valuable thing in the world?" Nasruddin answered without hesitation, "I consider advice the most valuable thing in the world." His friends thought about this for a few moments, and then one of them asked him, "And what do you consider the most worthless thing in the world?" Again Nasruddin replied without hesitating for a moment, "I consider advice the most worthless thing in the world." "Really?" said one of his friends. "You must be joking, Nasruddin. A minute ago you said that advice is the most valuable thing in the world, and now you say that it's the most worthless thing in the world. How can it be both the most valuable and the most worthless?" "Well," answered Nasruddin, If you think about the matter carefully, you'll see that I'm not joking and that I'm quite right. When you give somebody good advice and he takes it, advice is the most valuable thing in the world. But when you give a person advice and he doesn't take it, it is the most worthless thing in the world.
Number 19. Mrs. Jones was over 80, but she still drove her old car like a woman half her age. She loved driving very fast, and boasted of the fact that she had never, in her 35 years of driving, been punished for a driving offence. Then, one day, she nearly lost her record. A police car followed her, and the policeman in it saw her pass a red light without stopping. When Mrs. Jones came before the judge, he looked at her severely and said that she was too old to drive a car, and that the reason why she hadn't stopped at the red light was most probably that her eyes had become weak with old age, so that she had simply not seen it. When the judge had finished what he was saying, Mrs. Jones opened the big handbag she was carrying and took out her sewing. Without saying a word, she chose a needle with a very small eye and threaded it at her first attempt. When she had successfully done this, she took the thread out of the needle again and handed both the needle and the thread to the judge, saying, "Now it's your turn. I suppose you drive a car, and that you have no doubts about your own eyesight." The judge took the needle and tried to thread it. After half a dozen attempts, he had still not succeeded. The case against Mrs. Jones was dismissed, and her record remained unbroken.
Number 20. When a big ship is in very rough sea, it has to be able to bend a little, otherwise it may break in two. If one end of the ship is on the top of one huge wave, and the other end is on the top of another, with the middle of the ship hanging in between, or if one huge wave comes up under the middle of the ship, leaving the two ends hanging, the ship's own weight will break its back if it's quite stiff. To make a big ship elastic enough to avoid this danger, it has joints where the sections of the ship come together above the waterline, and these joints open and shut slightly as the waves lift one section of the ship or another. This is enough to save the ship from breaking into pieces. One day, a sailor was walking along a passageway in a big ship during a storm, when he was surprised to see a boy sitting comfortably in a chair at the end of the passageway, which was opposite one of the ship's joints. The boy had a bag of nuts beside him, and every time the ship was lifted by a wave and the joint opened, he put a nut in it. As the ship came down again, the joint closed and cracked the nut gently but firmly. The boy then took it out and put the next one in as the joint opened again.
Number 21. Dick was a clever boy, but his parents were poor, so he had to work in his spare time and during his holidays to pay for his education. In spite of this, he managed to get to the university, but it was so expensive to study there that during the holidays he found it necessary to get 2 jobs at the same time, so as to earn enough money to pay for his studies. One summer he managed to get a job in a butcher's shop during the daytime, and another in a hospital at night. In the shop he learnt to cut meat up quite nicely, so the butcher often left him to do all the serving while he went into a room behind the shop to do the accounts. In the hospital, on the other hand, he was, of course, allowed to do only the simplest jobs, like helping to lift people and to carry them from one part of the hospital to another. Both at the butcher's shop and at the hospital, Dick had to wear white clothes. One evening at the hospital, Dick had to help to carry a woman from her bed to the place where she was to have an operation. The woman was already feeling frightened at the thought of the operation before he came to get her. But when she saw Dick, that finished her. "No, no," she cried, "not my butcher. I won't be operated on by my butcher," and fainted away.
Number 22. Nasruddin was a poor man, so he tried to grow as many vegetables as he could in his own garden, so that he would not have to buy so many in the market. One evening he heard a noise in his garden and looked out of the window. A white ox had got into the garden and was eating his vegetables. Nasruddin at once took his stick, ran out and chased the ox, but he was too old to catch it. When he got back to his garden, he found that the ox had ruined most of his precious vegetables. The next morning, while he was walking in the street near his house, he saw a cart with 2 white oxen, which looked very much like the one that had eaten his vegetables. He was carrying his stick with him, so he at once began to beat the 2 oxen with it. As neither of them looked more like the ox that had eaten his vegetables than the other, he beat both of them equally hard. The owner of the ox cart was drinking coffee in a coffee house. When he saw what Nasruddin was doing to his animals, he ran out and shouted, "What are you doing? What have those poor animals done to you for you to beat them like that?" "You keep out of this," Nasruddin shouted back. "This is a matter between me and one of these 2 oxen. He knows very well why I'm beating him."
Number 23. The war had begun, and George had joined the Air Force. He wanted to be a pilot, and after some months he managed to get to the Air Force training school, where they taught pilots to fly. There, the first thing that new students had to do was to be taken up in a plane by an experienced pilot to give them some idea of what it felt like. Even those who'd travelled as passengers in commercial airline planes before found it strange to be in the cockpit of a small fighter plane, and most of the new students felt nervous. The officer, who had to take the students up for their first flight, allowed them to fly the plane for a few seconds, if they wanted to, and if they were not too frightened to try. But he was always ready to take over as soon as the plane started to do dangerous things. George was one of those who took over the controls of the plane when he went up in it for the first time. And after the officer had taken them from him again, George thought that he'd better ask a few questions to show how interested he was and how much he wanted to learn to fly. There were a number of instruments in front of him, so he chose one and asked the officer what it was. The officer looked at him strangely for a moment and then answered, "That is the clock."
Number 24. Mr. Robinson had to travel somewhere on business, and as he was in a hurry, he decided to go by air. He liked sitting beside a window when he was flying, so when he got onto the plane, he looked for a window seat. He found that all of them had already been taken, except for one. There was a soldier sitting in the seat beside this one, and Mr. Robinson was surprised that he hadn't taken the one by the window. But anyhow, he at once went towards it. When he reached it, however, he saw that there was a notice on it. It was written in ink and said, "This seat is reserved for proper load balance. Thank you." Mr. Robinson had never seen such a notice in a plane before, but he thought that the plane must be carrying something particularly heavy in its baggage room, which made it necessary to have the passengers properly balanced. So he walked on and found another empty seat, not beside a window, to sit in. 2 or 3 other people tried to sit in the window seat beside the soldier, but they too read the notice and went on. Then, when the plane was nearly full, a very beautiful girl stepped into the plane. The soldier, who was watching the passengers coming in, quickly took the notice off the seat beside him, and in this way succeeded in having the company of the girl during the whole of the trip.
Number 25. Mrs. Jones was very fond of singing. She had a good voice, except that some of her high notes tended to sound like a gate which someone had forgotten to oil. Mrs. Jones was very conscious of this weakness, and took every opportunity she could find to practice these high notes. As she lived in a small house, where she could not practice without disturbing the rest of the family, she usually went for long walks along the country roads whenever she had time, and practiced her high notes there. Whenever she heard a car or a person coming along the road, she stopped and waited until she could no longer be heard before she started practicing again, because she was a shy person, and because she was sensitive about those high notes. One afternoon, however, a fast, open car came up behind her so silently and so fast that she did not hear it until it was only a few yards from her. She was singing some of her highest and most difficult notes at the time, and as the car passed her, she saw an anxious expression suddenly come over its driver's face. He put his brakes on violently, and as soon as the car stopped, jumped out and began to examine all his tires carefully. Mrs. Jones did not dare to tell him what the noise he had heard had really been, so he got back into his car and drove off as puzzled as he had been when he stopped.
Number 26. April the 1st is a day on which, in some countries, people try to play tricks on others. If one succeeds in tricking somebody, one laughs and says, "April Fool." And then the person who has been tricked usually laughs too. One April the 1st, a country bus was going along a winding road when it slowed down and stopped. The driver anxiously turned switches and pressed buttons, but nothing happened. Then he turned to the passengers with a worried look on his face and said, "This poor bus is getting old. It isn't going as well as it used to. There's only one thing to do if we want to get home today. I shall count 3, and on the word 3, I want you all to lean forward suddenly as hard as you can. That should get the bus started again. But if it doesn't, I'm afraid there is nothing else I can do. Now, all of you, lean back as far as you can in your seats and get ready." The passengers all obediently pressed back against their seats and waited anxiously. Then the driver turned to his front and asked, "Are you ready?" The passengers hardly had enough breath to answer yes. 1, 2, 3, counted the driver. The passengers all swung forward suddenly, and the bus started up at a great rate. The passengers breathed more easily and began to smile with relief. But their smiles turned to surprised and then delighted laughter when the driver merrily cried, "April Fool!"
Number 27. The Women's College had a very small car park, and as several of the teachers and students, and many of the students' boyfriends, had cars, it was often difficult to find a place to park. The head of the college, whose name was Miss Baker, therefore had a special place in the car park for her own small car. There were white lines round it, and it had a notice saying, reserved for head of college. One evening, however, when Miss Baker got back to the college a few minutes before the time by which all students had to be in, she found another car in her parking space. There were 2 people in it, one of her girl students and a young man. Miss Baker knew that the young man would have to leave very soon, so she decided to ask him to move his car a bit so that she could park hers in the proper place for the night before going to bed. As the young man's car was close to the railings, Miss Baker had to drive up beside it on the other side, where the girl was sitting. She therefore came up on this side, opened her own window, and tapped her horn lightly to draw attention to the fact that she was there. The girl, who had her head on the boy's shoulder, looked around in surprise. She was even more surprised when she heard Miss Baker say, "Excuse me, but may I change places with you?"
Number 28. The soldiers had just arrived in France. None of them could speak any French except Harry, who boasted that he knew the language very well. The other soldiers didn't really believe him, because they knew that he was always boasting about something, and that what he said about himself was seldom true. For some days the soldiers were all kept in camp, so they had no need or opportunity to speak any French. But then the day came when they were allowed to leave for the weekend. "Now we can see whether you really speak French or not," they said to Harry. "All right," Harry answered. "Come with me and I'll show you." About 10 minutes after they had left the camp, they saw a pretty girl of about 20 on the other side of the road. They would all have liked to speak to her, but of course none of them knew any French except, perhaps, Harry. "Now's your chance to show us whether you can really speak French, Harry," said one of his friends. "Go and speak to that girl." "All right," Harry answered, and he crossed the road, smiled, bowed politely to the girl, and started to speak to her. He had said only a few sentences when the girl's face turned red, and she smacked his face angrily and walked off. Harry crossed the road to his friends again, his face all smiles, and said, "There you are. I told you I could speak French, didn't I?"
Number 29. When sailors are allowed ashore after a long time at sea, they sometimes get drunk and cause trouble. For this reason, the Navy always has naval police in big ports. When sailors cause trouble, the naval police come and deal with them. One day, the naval police in one big seaport received an urgent telephone call from a bar in the town. The barman said that a big sailor had got drunk and was breaking the furniture in the bar. The petty officer who was in charge of the naval police guard that evening said that he would come immediately. Now, petty officers who had to go and deal with sailors who were violently drunk usually chose the biggest naval policeman they could find to go with them. But this particular petty officer did not do this. Instead, he chose the smallest and weakest-looking man he could find to go to the bar with him and arrest the sailor who was breaking the furniture. Another petty officer who happened to be there was surprised when he saw the petty officer of the guard choose this small man. So he said to him, "Why don't you take a big man with you? You may have to fight the sailor who is drunk." "Yes, you are quite right," answered the petty officer of the guard. "That's exactly why I'm taking this small man. If you saw 2 policemen coming to arrest you, and one of them was much smaller than the other, which one would you attack?"
Number 30. The manager of a small building company was very surprised to get a bill for 2 white mice which one of his workmen had bought. He sent for the workman and asked him why he'd had the bill sent to the company. "Well," the workman answered, "you remember the house we were repairing in Newbridge last week, don't you? One of the things we had to do there was to put in some new electric wiring. Well, in one place we had to pass some wires through a pipe 30 feet long and about an inch across, which was built into solid stone and had 4 big bends in it. None of us could think how to do this until I had a good idea. I went to a shop and bought 2 white mice, one of them male and the other female. Then I tied a thread to the body of the male mouse and put him into the pipe at one end, while Bill held the female mouse at the other end and pressed her gently to make her squeak. When the male mouse heard the female mouse's squeaks, he rushed along the pipe to help her. I suppose he was a gentleman, even though he was only a mouse. Anyway, as he ran through the pipe, he pulled a thread behind him. It was then quite easy for us to tie one end of the thread to the electric wires and pull them through the pipe. The manager paid the bill for the white mice.